interferes with the presentation, or because it can actually limit the way the sound comes through, or interfere with the overall presentation. Also, you can choose to put on either the speaker view or the gallery view. At this point, of course, what you see on your screen is the PowerPoint presentation that Birgit will be showing us. And but later on, after that, when we get into the audience discussion portion, you certainly can put yourself on screen and either maximize the speaker view if you like, or just keep what's called the gallery view. And each device is different, so you might have to figure it out on your own device. But in any event, a good portion of this program, as most of our programs are, involve you, the audience, comments, questions, and participation. Birgit has a wonderful presentation developed, and it's my pleasure to introduce her. Birgit currently works as the Interim Assistant Director of Admissions and CCOG Student Success Navigator over at Brookdale College. I wish I had remembered to ask Birgit what CCOG means, but maybe she'll tell us when she comes on. She's lived in Monmouth County for 27 years. So I think of Birgit as more than just a resident, but an activist because of everything that she's been involved in. She was the former chair of the Monmouth County Human Relations Commission, the past board member of our lunch break here in Red Bank, and a current board member of the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation, also here in Red Bank. She's witnessed firsthand the barriers that plague certain communities because of this experience, and most likely personal stories as well. So her efforts to make education accessible for all has led her to work at Brookdale Community College, which is a benchmark for exceptional, affordable academic achievement. And if you're not familiar with Brookdale, it is a standout community college in the country. The yellow brick road of opportunity is actually paved with cobblestones of education. Birgit feels compelled to utilize her knowledge and years of lived experience to help facilitate truth and reconciliation of our American reality. She says, when all is said and done, I believe history will prove that the only true weapon of mass destruction is racism. So I'd like to welcome Birgit, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Patty. And thank you, Linda. And of course, thank you to the Red Bank Public Library for inviting me to just participate in this conversation. I think it an honor, and it's certainly a pleasure for me to be here and for me to be sharing my perspectives. And I certainly hope that by the end of this presentation and our conversation, we will all have some food to chew on, some food for thought, and maybe a little incentive to our spirits, because that is really what the intention here is. We are in a place and time where it's causing us to ask questions such as, what does it mean to be an American? Now, that might seem on the surface as a very easy question to maybe answer, but when we start giving it some real thought, it becomes more and more difficult, more involved, and it's taking a bit more conscientiousness on our parts to really dissect that and to really come to a conclusion about what being an American is for us as Americans. So I wanted to frame this conversation in a way that will allow us to consider maybe certain things that we haven't considered in the past, and for us to have some points in which we can discuss later. And my approach when I tried to answer this question for myself really came down to a few things. And first place that I thought we needed to start was literally to define what it is that America is. So we all have different ideas based on our experiences and our ideologies. But where does that experience and ideology come from? That's the question, right? Before we can call ourselves Americans, we must first define America from its founding. This is really extremely important because how America began is intrinsically tied to the evolution of who we are today. And what you see on the screen are tentacles and offshoots and idealisms of how we may see ourselves, how we may define ourselves. But I particularly want you to keep in mind that image in the center, because if there was a root to the tree of America, that's it. So just keep that in mind. So from the inception, from our inception, whether you consider that to be 1619 with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans, or 1620 with the arrival of the Mayflower, or 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, the idea of America was great in concept, but flawed in practice. And we're going to demonstrate exactly what that means. America was birthed in the inherent defective design of enslavement of Africans by white Europeans. Black people were a dehumanized free labor source worth its weight in gold, and that is literal. Brutalized, subjugated, and constitutionally excluded from being Americans. And this too is important because if you have a group of people who are literally worth their weight in gold, then how is it that they're excluded from the full total sum of what America is? And yet they were. The only true Americans, the Native Americans, either died of diseases introduced by whites or were killed in battles, fighting to keep their lands and way of life. Survivors were then relegated to reservations through despicable treaties that left them isolated and desolated. The burgeoning colonies that became America did so at the express expense and exclusion of people of color. And this is super important. These institutional policies definitively established now and then that the first and foremost prerequisite of being American is to be white. This is the conclusion that we draw from our inception. And this is what we move forward in our development. The DNA of discrimination was subsequently imprinted in our governmental policies, procedures, laws, and down through the generations. It is evident in the recantation of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Case in point, Amendments 13 through 15. These are considered the Reconstruction Amendments. And this is what should have happened after the Civil War. This is what we fought for. This is the ideal that we were going after, to right the wrong of slavery. So what happened? With the 13th Amendment, slavery was repealed. But if you read that carefully, there's a little caveat that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the 13th Amendment, in effect, has set the stage for what we now see as mass incarceration. Now, there was incarceration back then as well on a mass scale. But again, this DNA that began then has worked its way through the generations to reflect these very same ideals. And what did that result in? An exodus of Black people from various parts of the South where they were being persecuted and lynched and terrorized in what we now know as the Great Migration. And what about the 14th Amendment? Well, that was to naturalize all citizens, to grant citizenship to all who were born or were naturalized in America. Well, we know what happened. Blacks were systematically excluded from that as well. And that was done on an institutional legal basis, something that we're going to consider in the next slide. As a result, there was segregation that more than limited citizenship. We actually had more citizenship prior to the 14th Amendment than we did after the 14th Amendment. And I'm trying to show you how the very same things that were meant to save us actually worked for our detriment. The 15th Amendment that would have allowed all people to vote, again, excluded people of color. There were loopholes such as the poll tax and the grandfather clause and literacy test that all formed a basis to continue to exclude people of color, particularly Black people. So again, at every turn where we tried to right a wrong, we ended up reversing that in theory and in practice. And that's the reason why I also have forget the 40 acres and a mule, because that too was promised, but was not delivered. We couldn't get basic rights, and we certainly couldn't get tangible rights that would move us into a generational way of creating wealth. And that's what the 40 acres and a mule was supposed to have done. But in short order, in 8 years' time after Reconstruction, it was over. And that followed various periods of terrorism by America. And I'm not going to go into as many of those instances as I could. But I will say that Greenwood was one of them. So, the United States Supreme Court in 1896, ruling that Plessy versus Ferguson literally legitimized and legalized the separate but equal doctrine. Now, as you can see on that screen, it says separate but not equal. Well, make no mistake about it. When this ruling was set into place, that was the intention and the intent. It couldn't have been other way. It couldn't have been otherwise, or would never have been ruled in favor of to begin with. This sanctioned the creation of domestic terrorism against Black people and gave rise to Jim Crow laws, legislating the separation of Blacks and whites on every level, even in death. Blacks and whites could not be buried together. Again, keep in mind, we're talking about the creation of America and what it means to be American. These are all portions, these are all elements of the creation of America. They were there then, and they are present now. From this perspective, we have all been assigned positions on the American color line. Whites at one end, Blacks at the other, and everyone else in between, arranged from lightest to darkest. Our potential, everything we are or are not, is predicated by where we fall in the hue of this line. This line consistently continues to determine how we individually and collectively experience America, ultimately defining our Americanness and what that affords us. So keep in mind, Americanness, being American, has been long since determined. As you can see by that line, the whiter you are, the most American you're considered. The darker you are, the less American you're considered. And even now, when a person of color manages to transcend this line, even at its pinnacle, their Americanness is often challenged. And we know this because it was evident in that birther controversy of President Barack Obama. We know there was this huge uproar and uptick about him not being American and therefore not being a true and valued president. The same thing occurred with Colin Kaepernick. He was excommunicated from the Society of American. He was considered less American, un-American, a traitor, and was referred to as an SOB by the current president. This is how we continue to reflect this DNA of discrimination that was put into place and has been acted upon from the beginning and the inception of America. And that is why, even now, non-whites often hear the refrain, "Go back to where you came from," solely based on physical appearance of whiteness. People who say that to other people don't know them. They simply presume that because the person they're referring to is not white, that person must have come from somewhere else and therefore is not American. So again, we're acting on this premise that whiteness equates to being American. That's a lie, it's a flaw, but it's one of the ideologies that we have adapted because of the origins of our country. So, whiteness. Whiteness not only presumes Americanness, it endows those who are white with certain inalienable privileges. Now, I'm using those words because these are the words that are found in our Constitution. They just didn't put white in there. So I'm going to do you a favor and actually say it as it was intended. If you were to open a box of privilege, it would say, by virtue of your whiteness, you are hereby entitled to the automatic presumption of innocence, intelligence, integrity, credibility, acceptance. You are considered fully human and fully American. Disclaimer, never openly acknowledge your privilege to others or you might lose it. This is what we're talking about when we talk about white privilege. It tends to be overused, but it needs to be defined. So white privilege defined is everything you're seeing on that screen. It's everything that is locked within the potential of being American. In America, whiteness has a profound generational influence on what it means to be American. It affects the legacy we'll likely be born into. It affects our parental households, whether our parents will be married or not, where we will live, what we will live in. It affects our educational opportunities. It affects the likelihood of incarceration. And you can see clearly from that screen, there's a huge disparity. This is part of that DNA, that 13th Amendment that we talked about way back when, all of it being translated straight down through the generations with evidence as we are seeing right now. Being white in America affects access to healthcare and life expectancy. And in a full circle moment, as it was intended, it affects the legacy of what we leave to our children. And this is the true deprivation of what this does to our country. Therefore, being American means different things for different people, not to, but for. That's a huge difference. What American means should mean the same for all, even if it means different things to different people. But in America, it does not. Being American should mean those things are the same, but they are not. How you see yourself is what America is to you. what America does for you is what should be the same for us all. Yet, some will give their lives to keep it this way, while others will do the same to change it. Sadly, this is the only thing that we have consistently agreed upon. Now, here are the questions. How has America, or the history of America, shaped your experiences as an American? And where do you fall on the color line? How American are you, or how American does that make you? Meaning, how American are you perceived to be? This is where we came from, and now this is where we are. So with that, I'm going to open the floor to discussion and questions, but I certainly hope that it's given you some thought, given you something to think about, things that you may have taken for granted and things that you may have assumed to be the same for all that isn't. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing right now. I can always go back to the slide if anyone wants to make a reference to it so that we can discuss what it's all about. So I know I've done a lot of talking, maybe a little more than I intended. But at this point, I would really love to hear your thoughts on being America. And I've hoped that I've provided a background for where we're building this conversation and why we're talking about America as America exists.
Thank you so much, Birgit. I just want to say, everybody, a lot of people, most people, in fact, have their, they're not showing their faces. We love to see everyone's faces. So if you feel that you'd like to share your faces, we'd love to see them. And definitely, please let us know your thoughts. I just want to say one thing. I have 3 sons, one of whom dated a young woman. She was a girl when they started dating, whose folks were from Taiwan. And often when they would go out, people would always say to Kathy, "Where are you from?" And Kathy would say, "America." And they would be like, "No, but where are you from?" And then sometimes she would say, "Marlboro." And then they'd be, "Well, where are you from?" And, she knew what they were asking, of course, after being asked this from a young child on. She was asked this question. She was born in America. Her parents were from Taiwan, and people wouldn't be happy until finally she answered that her folks were from Taiwan. And, as a white person, this was something very new to my son to, always, wherever they went, to have his girlfriend contend with this. So with that, anybody else's thoughts we would love to have. We have some things in the chat.
I see Maritza. Would you like to unmute, Maritza, and share your comment?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, when you were talking about asking where is she from, where is she from, where is she from, I used to always hear, "What are you?" And human? I don't know what you mean like that. I'm a girl. At that time when I was younger, it was the teenagers would all ask me, "Well, what are you? What are you? Are you this or are you that?" I'm like, "No, I'm from here." And even still today, I teach Spanish, and my students ask me, "Well, where are you from?" And I'll say, "No, I'm American." They'll say, "Wait, you're born here?" I'm like, "Yeah, the town next door I was born." But they just like, it's so hard for them to believe. And some of them tell me I have an accent.
You know what, Marissa?
I'm like, "You're really, really pushing that because I have a Jersey accent because I've been here forever." So yeah.
Well, you know what, Marissa?
Sometimes it makes me feel not like I'm something else.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I was getting at, because the presumption of being American is to be white. And therefore, if you're not white, you must have come from somewhere else. You must be something else. And therefore, we're inquiring as to what that is. And that presumption of whiteness comes from our inception.
And my father is blonde hair and blue eyes.
Yeah, but
And
that's
I also got that, well, he's not your biological father though. You're adopted, right? From coworkers that I worked with for 15 years, and they would ask, well, what, you were adopted? No. And then they would look at me like, oh, you don't know you're adopted?
Yeah. And I get that very same question as well. You know, what are you? Where do you come from? And, you know, I dare to say that I'm sure there are lots of white people, maybe in this room, maybe not, who have come from other places, but have never been asked that question.
Right.
Right? So again, there is the presumption. There is the assumption that white means American and anything else means you're not.
Actually, I have a story as well. Our daughter was looking for a job as a journalist, and a friend of hers knew somebody who worked for the New York Times, and he shared my daughter's resume. And the guy's looking at the resume. So her last name is spelled white with a Y, so that's funny. Her first name is a Middle Eastern name. She has lived in Maine, the Navajo Reservation in Arizona, and spent time in Uganda. So the guy's looking at this resume and he says to the friend, "What is she?" So, I mean, that's probably you know, she's really sort of a pale little white girl, but again, and we just seem to have this built-in tendency in this country to have to pigeonhole people.
But it's, you know, but Patty, it's more than pigeonhole. It's to identify, right? Because that identity comes with those privileges.
Absolutely.
So we need to separate and identify based on who deserves to be and who doesn't. And that's the one way that we do it, and we do it constantly. And we're not in 1896 anymore, but yet that particular type of questioning, that type of I call it a verbal assault in a lot of cases where people insist, insist, you know, and usually the people who are insisting are white, because they're establishing their right for and your right not. See, so this is one of the reasons why we're finding that we're in the kind of flux that we're in right now, because America is actually changing in that demographic. And those who are identifying and have always identified America as white are now being forced to see it in a different way. And that, for those people, is extremely unsettling, because again, it cuts right to their definition of American and being American.
So, but before we take other comments, I'm going to put something in the chat box. It's a link to a short 12-minute YouTube video by Carrie Twigg, who used to work in the Obama White House. And she does a little talk on what is our role in creating the American identity. And in the talk, she mentions how in the year or around the year 2040, the population of the United States is projected to become a majority non-white. And this is another, this is related to what we're speaking about, because there is a level of panic among certain portions of our population, because this train is coming down the tracks.
Very much so. Very much so. But I wonder, for those of you in the audience, have you considered yourselves as part of a point on this line of color? Have you ever had that perception of being American in that particular sense? And I'm sure that depending on who you are, there will be different answers.
Yeah.
But
well, and I think as a white person, like years ago when I was younger, and if that question were posed to me, quite honestly, one of the first things that would come to mind would be freedom. Like as a white person, oh, it's the land of the free. Oh, I'm free. And you don't think of, in any way other than you're free. And, I think Americans are very big on talking about their freedoms. But I mean, even today, we have slavery in America. It's changed. It might be, using illegal people to do our labor and paying them, ridiculous wages and no health insurance and no living really accommodate, but it's a form of slavery. So if you ask someone that might be working, picking blueberries, what does being American mean to them? You're going to get a very different answer than if you ask somebody that's very affluent, that doesn't have to think about where their next meal is coming.
Right. And Linda, I'm glad that you mentioned that word, freedom. Because that's probably the first thing that comes to mind when you say to someone, what does it mean to be an American? And they'll say, well, it's a land of the brave, the home of the free.
Right.
And really, those are what I see as, without being derogative, but mindless responses, right? Unconscious responses. Because where we are now forces us to take a better look at that answer. When you say freedom, I mean, that's what I talked about when I said that's the premise. That was the idea, but not the practice, right? It was maybe practice for some, but not for all. And again, that's where I talk about what does America mean for all as opposed to all, because those two things are completely different. So, to say land of the brave and home of the free, well, that's really wonderful. But if it only applies to certain people, then is it really that?
Right.
And for those people who have it, what does it mean for them versus the people who don't have it?
Right.
Yeah, Julie has her hand up.
Julie has her hand up, right?
Hi, so I agree very much with everything that's been said. And it's bad enough being of color and being, being in that situation on the mainland. But after Hurricane Maria, we saw that those of us who are of color in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, we didn't exist to get any, help. People were shocked that those were Americans that were living in those islands, that got hit with Hurricane Maria. So it just showed you how, even whether you're mainland or if you're American in a territory, it's even worse too. You're not considered, and
That's right.
a people that would need help or assistance from the government.
Thank you for bringing that up, Julie. As we can all remember, Hurricane Katrina, and we all remember what happened in New Orleans. This was right here on American soil. So there wasn't even the excuse of, oh, well, they're over there like Puerto Rico is, or, the American Virgin Islands, or any of those territories that America still holds. We're talking about what happens even within the very present land of America when it comes to certain people of certain persuasions. So, of course, it's extenuating to those who are territories that are even outside of the actual land of America. But we can see that that's exactly right. So again, this idea of freedom and what it means to be America, and those definitions, that way we define privilege. And in that definition of privilege, I intentionally said to be considered fully human. That's very intricate to how we respond to people. And you're talking about the responses when they're disasters. Well, if you're not considered fully human or fully American, then the response doesn't have to be fully anything. Whatever you get. As a matter of fact, I believe a particular past president said they ought to be glad that we are even giving them anything. Or maybe there should be a succession of this particular island or this particular place, because we no longer want to be responsible for them. You see, again, it's that idea of who's fully American, who's fully human, who's entitled to these, inalienable privileges that we talk about. So it's unpacking all of that to make it relevant to the experiences we're having. And then those experiences are what determine how we feel ourselves to be American or not American. I dare say that maybe those people who suffered in hurricanes and in disasters weren't feeling very American at all. And that's the reason.
I was wondering if I could ask my friend Rao Andavolu to maybe share a little bit, because I think he has, I did invite him to share a little bit of his experience in this country. Would you say something, Rao?
Thank you.
Unmute.
Took me a little while to unmute myself. Good evening, everyone.
Yeah.
Yes, I do want to share my experiences as an American. I came to this country as an immigrant about 40 years ago. And when I came in, it was totally a different land. I was from India. I'm from India, and I didn't come here because there was no facilities in India at that time, but I wanted to come here to see how things are. And interestingly, they were good in the beginning. I progressed very well in my profession, and but at every step you could see that there is an unseen border that you couldn't cross. There is something that people. One time, very clearly, this white gentleman who was my maybe 4-year senior, I was talking with him over a cup of coffee about a job that was there in a university setting. And he said, yeah, that's a very good job, but they're not going to give it to you. That was his response. And it was very, very demoralizing, to say the least. Of course, since then I have passed that stage, and I went beyond what I was expecting at that university. But the very point that the very thought that you could say something to a person like that and get away with it is very what you said, like Birgit, is un-American, honestly. And these are the little kinds of things that I had to face. And when we went to a shop, when we did shopping once, one lady just looked at me and he said, "You should go back to where you came from." And that was, again, these are things where, as an educated professional, I don't take up an adversarial position and then talk back and say things. If I wanted to, I think yes, I could have. But then the way I've been brought up is different. So I said, look, all I think is that she who said this really doesn't have a good view of humanity. So their views are very limited in their scope. And so it's under those circumstances they operate. But I used to more or less pity them rather than get mad at them. Of course, there are situations when I got mad at them, but didn't really express it very openly. Exactly. So, but what I've seen in the last 4 years is something that I've never thought, I'm not alone in that, but I never thought I would ever see in a country like this. Where I came from, India was about, I would say 24, 25 years independent at that time. And then I'm coming here to a country which has just celebrated 200 years of independence. And yet, when I lived here for about 35 years, I noticed that there is a whole lot of something which was lying underneath that seems to be, welling up. The unsatisfied feeling of certain group of people, essentially whites, that they are being outnumbered. But that's very, very common. But that's what, if you look at India also, that's what happened. When the time of independence, it was 85 to 88% Hindus. Now they're down to 75. it does happen. This is the flow of events in life. So you cannot really prevent these things. If you want to prevent, then you have to have walls all around and not allow anybody to come in. And that's not who we as human beings are. I think we are human beings as such. We will be wanting to interact with people. I've also seen people who said it's nice to see people from various countries. This is my residency program. It's very nice to see people from different countries come here. We know how things are getting done there and what, we can learn a lot from them. So there are people like that too, amongst the whites who have been, I'm sure, you've experienced that too. But it is very unfortunate to see that kind of a feeling again well up now. And I can only hope that, people will realize that what nobody can really prevent what is to happen. And I hope we'll find a balance sometime in the future that I can see.
So Rao, my husband Jim has a question for you.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Rao. We've met, I think.
Yes, we have.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about freedom, and I was thinking about, I mean, you've been here, what, 40 years, you said? Or
Yeah.
You've been here quite a long time. But would you say there's any freedom that you have here that you didn't have in India? I mean, anything that would make a real difference in your life?
Not really. I was able to vote there. I was able to express myself there. But in general, the life is different. You don't express yourself that much. It's more of a social thing that in India we don't really, we respect the adults, and so when a 40-year-old man speaks, the 13-year-old listens. And that was something that I really enjoyed here, coming here, because I could really speak to a 70-year-old man when I was 30-year-olds, and I could tell them what I think. You couldn't do that. That's the kind of a. It's not. I wouldn't call it a freedom, but it is.
It's a cultural thing rather than.
It's cultural. Exactly.
I mean, when we talk about freedom here, it's supposed to be baked into our founding documents and all that. But
right. I mean, those things, I've never found anything less in India when I was there.
Yeah.
Nor many people feel it at this time too in India.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Rao. I wasn't sure if there was anybody or there would be anyone in the audience who had actually been told to go back to where you've come from. I guess we have one. The real tragedy of that is what we've done is we've effectively arrested our potential. Because what that means is if you alienate groups of people because of whatever your beliefs are, it means that you are less than by that number of people. And in being less than, that includes everything that comes with those groups of people. You said just now maybe building walls. Well, as you probably have heard, that's exactly what the idea was supposed to have been, was to build these walls to stop everybody who was undesirable in whose ever opinion from coming in. But I dare say again, that's short-sightedness and ignorance, because when you build walls, you not just lock or block everybody from coming in, but you also block people from going out. And that means you stifle your own development, you stifle your own potential, and you stifle your hopes for tomorrow, because as you said, life is a progression. But for certain people who've enjoyed certain inalienable rights, for them, they can't see progressing beyond all of the privileges they already have. But I propose that should they open their minds to see just that, their privileges will probably increase and not decrease, because then they'll have less of a burden in keeping that particular group of people in their particular place. And then we can all really enjoy the idea of what America should and is supposed to have been for everyone. See, what we're doing right now is we're literally walking around with weights on our feet. We're not allowing ourselves to rise to our potential. And it's all based in race. And that's really the anomaly of America.
And
mean,
Birgit, I think
I'm sorry, madam.
sorry, who was
One
that?
more
Go
thing,
ahead.
if you don't mind. Yeah,
Yes,
I've not
please.
experienced this in India, but my grandfather's generation and to some extent my father's generation has been under the British rule. And the British rule was nothing but pure white privilege to the max. And people have been starved, not because rice didn't grow, but because they wanted to have it for others outside of India. And it's the white soldiers that they wanted to feed. That's why the Bihar famine of Bihar was really created by British. So we've seen that, heard that, but I've not really experienced that there. But here, when I come and see this here and experience certain of these things, I think there needs to be a change, has to come.
Right. And if you recall in one of those slides, when I talked about the creation of America, one of those characteristics was greed. It's always a characteristic when you can make other people do other things for you that you should be doing for yourself. Because there's going to be nothing within that moral compass that says, well, this is enough or that's enough. Maybe we should turn this around or do other things. There's always that element of enough is never enough. So even when you have people in servitude and in bondage and people who have been subjugated, you always think that, well, if I got this from them, I can get more from them. So these colonial types of imperialism always involve that element, as I said, in the elements of creation, the element of greed, because had they not been greedy, they would have made room for everyone. And that's what led to the genocide of the Native Indians. Because again, it was not in just taking some of the land, it was in taking all of the land. So if you need all of the land, then the people who are living on it have to be eliminated or put somewhere else. And so these ideas are common in any type of colonialistic, imperialistic regimes, including the probably the biggest perpetrators. I mean, the British. I mean, that is where America came from, ultimately. So it stands to reason that we brought those characteristics with us. So,
Birgit, I really like how you continue to emphasize the point of humanity and the way we treat each other as more human or less human. One of the concepts that is in this little video I shared on the chat is her observation that by virtue of being human, we all have some sort of implicit bias. It just can't be helped. No matter how well we've been brought up, there is some kind of bias because we absorb things unconsciously. I think those who believe they are white may absorb many more negative stereotypes towards non-whites. But I also put in the chat this little, it's a little online implicit bias test that Harvard has made available. I did it myself today. It takes about 10 minutes. There's actually 14 different versions of bias you can test yourself for. It's really a worthwhile exercise, but I think we all should take the time to identify what our bias is and take the steps necessary to overcome it.
I agree.
And the thing is, we all have to recognize, I go back to that racial anonymous group that, you know, is all over the country now. We all have some kind of bias, given the color of your skin, how you were brought up. I mean, I remember so well when I first traveled out of the country and I saw some Asians wearing masks. And at that time, I know there was something in my head that I thought, wow, that's really odd, or, you know, and there was a little maybe negativity there, like, oh, well, what's that about? And I laugh now because we're all wearing masks, we're all covered up, but there was a little bias there somehow about that mask wearing when I first saw it, like, you know, and it's just interesting. We'll look at someone and right away form an opinion because of how we were brought up or what our biases were, you know, when we were younger, or if we grew up in a segregated environment. And certainly if you've grown up in New Jersey, you know, you probably haven't, in many communities, had an opportunity to meet other cultures.
I agree. I definitely agree with the fact that we all have biases. When you think about it, biases really are based on lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
As you
Right.
mentioned, and not only is it lack of knowledge, but that implicit type of bias is an intentional lack of knowledge, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, you know, the types of things that we engage in, the groups of friends that we have, where we work and engage and you know, have fun or whatever that is, we need to open up our spheres of inclusion so that we can put to rest a lot of these biases that we have. The other thing that we need to note is biases, depending on who's having them and the power that that particular entity or individual has, is then put into practice. So, I mean, I'm sure you've heard, well, everybody's prejudiced, but not everybody is racist. I might have gotten that backwards. But the implication there is there's a power to act on your beliefs. And so even when you have a belief, if you have no power to act on it, it doesn't excuse it, but it actually nullifies it. The problem that we run into is when people have certain beliefs and they're able to act on those beliefs and enact certain rules and regulations and laws and all of that, that then come back to affect us all. So we need to work on both levels. We need to work on ourselves. And more importantly, we need to be aware of those people who have the power to act on their biases.
Sure.
Right. When the biases become institutionalized.
Exactly.
And it's to the detriment of people.
Of others.
Okay. And there's violence and restriction and discrimination.
Exactly.
That kind of thing. Yeah.
I saw a comment here in the chat. Someone had to leave. It says, "I love you all so much. I'm grateful to Birgit for a magnificent, provoking presentation. Next time, I would like to see more equitable chance for audience for attendees to talk." And well, I'm sorry that Donna felt that way. I certainly hope that everybody else felt that they had an opportunity to speak and to talk and to engage. The idea of the presentation was just to give us a frame of reference in where all of our ideologies and all of our experiences may stem from, because some people, believe it or not, are not aware of it. They feel a certain way, but they don't know why. They think a certain thing, but they don't know where it came from. They'll say things like, well, that's what I've always known, or that's what I've learned, or, you know, and literally give it that type of, not give it the weight that it deserves. So the idea of the presentation was first to do that, so that when we begin to speak, we can have a frame of reference as to where all of these competing ideas are coming from. So hopefully Donna will feel more included in the conversation at the
Well,
next.
that's why I made a point in the beginning of the session. I put in the chat and I asked people to put their notes in here if they'd like to speak up. I just put it again. Because of the way the screens are, although everybody is fitting on my screen, but you can't necessarily see a person raise their hand. We do have the raise hand button, but that's not always visible. So please, friends,
Unmute
everyone is
yourselves.
welcome to
You can
speak
unmute
up.
yourselves and actually, you know, give your comment. And if we're not calling on you, it's probably because we don't see you, not because we're ignoring you. Because that is the idea behind all of these conversations, is to talk.
So I'll actually, on that note, I'll pick up and get involved.
Okay.
How are you?
Okay.
Secondly, just going back to one of your original questions, in the beginning, kind of where do you see yourself on the color line? And it's interesting. Obviously, a white man in America, there's for me on the color line after, the year that we've had and really kind of, I would say, coming out of, my comfort zone. Being white in America, to me, is first off, I think of power comes to mind. And then personally with that, then the responsibility to use that because of the systems that are in place and because of the history in there. Not that whiteness innately needs power, but I think through the conversation I'm explained where the society and the structures that have been built, banking, all of those different industries, education, that our society has been built to build that up, and so kind of the awareness of where I was born into, nothing earned, but where I was born into, and what comes with that, having a consciousness, to me, I feel a responsibility to use that and to move things forward, to support Black business, to do things like that so that we can move forward. But a lot of it comes from a place of, I think, we talk about that ignorance and that blissful ignorance that, kind of comes with the color of the skin. And I think through the COVID, pandemic that we're in, one of the weird kind of positive that comes out on us is it puts us all on it. We now have a common struggle. And it's almost like, before, what was that common struggle? And so is there an opportunity in the moment, in the year that we live in which, that we can build on it? And I think we've seen some chinks in the armor, over the last year of that. But, the real question is, we just had the trial, and the verdict, which was appropriate, in my opinion. But will we continue to carry on and move the conversation forward, or will the conversation stop at the end of summer, because people have forgot about it? So for me, going back to the question again, like, where do I fall on the color line? Being a white male in America and really being willing to, try and make myself uncomfortable and step into those situations. We've had conversations, Bridget, and I have conversations at work. It's like, for me, it's that responsibility to take the privileges that I've been given and use them to help my fellow Americans. Because what I've done is I don't reference, a Black man was killed. It's an American that was killed. It's an American. And how can I watch anybody, a countryman of mine, go through that and be okay with the country I'm in? And that's kind of some of what I've gone through in the last year, and some of what, I think being an American now means to me.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Chad.
Can I just say, like I said, when we started, we're doing this program close to 6 years. And in that time, quite frankly, I think this conversation, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. If we're going to change anything in the world, and certainly in our country, we have to change things racially. It's as important as global issues. Like, we can't continue to live as Americans the way we've been living. It has to change. I mean, the country is changing. Colors of people are changing, and also as far as a lot of our climate change and global issues, they're tied to racial issues. You know, when it comes to environmental issues, people in our country that are of color, frequently they're going to be the ones that have problems with their water more than people that are more affluent. They're going to be the ones that are next to cell phone towers and pesticides. And as you see things change climate-wise, you're going to see migration issues and more people coming to America. So I really do feel this can't be a conversation that ends this summer. It's a conversation that if we don't continue, we're really doomed as a country. Not to be negative, but
That's
So,
true.
Comment.
That's true.
Birgit,
Yeah.
Stevie had something in the chat box. I don't know if you want to make
Yeah.
a comment,
Yeah.
Stevie, and then
And then
after that is Maria Carmen.
Maria
Yeah,
Carmen.
Maria, yes. Thank you for that, Linda, as well. But to Chad, you know, I just wanted to make a comment to that, to what you were saying. And we most certainly need allies. And, you know, and I say to people, you know, don't be an ally for me, be an ally for yourself. Do it for you. Because we're not living in, you know, in a vacuum. And improving our country is not only going to help me, it's going to help you, it's going to help us all collectively. So people tend to think of, well, you know, I'm going to do this for you and you're going to do that for me. And I always say, no, just do it for you. Do it because it's the right thing to do. And when you do recognize, it was that portion of my presentation where I talked about not speaking about your privileges out loud if you want to keep them. That too is a misnomer. But again, if you ask a person with them, they will say, yeah, that's about right. Let's not acknowledge this thing that we have, because if we do, then it's going to force us to have to change it. And that is exactly right. It will force you to have to change it, but it will allow you to become more human, not less.
Yeah.
It will allow you to become more American, not less. And that's the reason why this privilege, this box of privilege, has been that thing that's been shoved under the bed and tucked away in hopes of preserving it. But really what's happening is it's withering and dying just from isolation. We need to open it up and extend it so that we can all be better because of those inalienable rights that only some enjoy. So with that, Maria, and then I'll go back to Stevie. I don't want to keep Maria waiting.
yeah. Maria?
Yeah,
Hi.
I just wanted to share a little bit because I had a kind of unique perspective growing up because I was born in the US. So I sound totally New Jersey. But both my parents were born in Spain, and they actually were born like literally a 15-minute drive from each other, but they had both had very different experiences in the US because my mom came here as a young girl. I think she was 9 years old. And she went through the school system. As a matter of fact, it was Catholic school, and there was no ESL, and there was like, you're learning English or you're 9 years old and you're in kindergarten until you do. My father came here as a young man. He was already in his 20s, early 20s, but still he had already had a lot of a life growing up in Spain. But they also look very different. Spain has been like a real melting pot, if you look at the history of it. Some of it very ugly. But my mom is very fair skinned, pin straight hair, greenish eyes, hazel eyes, gets freckles. She looks very white. So nobody questions her Americanness, even though she was born in Spain. Because she came as a young child and she learned English, like she speaks fluently, she has no accent. My father is very dark. He has that dark olive complexion and it gets darker in the sun, and he's worked in construction his whole life. Very short, very curly hair, dark brown eyes. He looks un-American by our American standards. And especially coming to the US in his early 20s, he didn't have he wasn't educated here. Very intelligent, but very strong accent. He taught himself English. How hard is that to do as a 20-something-year-old to learn English from records? But people have always, my perspective growing up, I've always seen how people treat my parents differently. People will always just automatically talk to my mom, assume she's intelligent, which I mean she is, but just assume it because she's very fair-skinned and she speaks English fluently, and assume that my father is, an idiot in plain English, and putting it mildly, because he's dark and because he has a thick accent. And it's just very unfair. And I witnessed it as a child, and I think that's affected me. So when I hear people speak, it's like, yeah, I know, I've seen it. Even though I didn't personally experience it myself, I saw, the hatred and the bigotry and the assumptions made about my dad, as opposed to my mom, even though, I'm telling you, 15 minutes away from each other in Spain. They just happened to meet here, but they had very different lives growing up because of the way they look in the US, and the way they speak, but primarily the way they look, because that's before my dad even opens his mouth. I saw the disrespect, and then he'd open his mouth and he'd have an accent, and he's very intelligent, but it didn't matter. It was, the assumption was, you're an idiot. And the assumption was given to my mom, who always asked my dad, because she knew how smart he was, for his opinion, but it was always this respect is immediate to my mom. And my dad had to work so hard and still struggled and didn't get the respect that he deserved, So I just wanted to share that because it kind of goes with our topic.
Yeah.
And it's personal.
Wow, I could hear that in your voice. And I appreciate you sharing it. You were actually in the unique position of seeing, those that when I talked about the color line, you were right there to see the disparity between the most white and the least white, and how that's interpreted and how that's treated. So a lot of us only get one or the other, but you were actually able to experience the disparity of what it is to be one or the other. So thank you for sharing that, because that brings it home. Oh, Stevie, we were going to talk about what she mentioned, right? Thank you, Stevie. Let's see, where were we? Did I pass?
Stevie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I don't know. She put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you there, Stevie?
Yeah, maybe she's.
Yeah, I thought she might have something to share because she's got a lot of experience in cross-cultural
She did have something in the chat here.
Oh, I can read it. She said, I found this conversation to be very connected, very eye-opening, open and honest, stimulating. I think the level of participation and depth has been fantastic. Do you have something to add, Stevie?
Just unmuted myself. I'm sorry. No, not really. It's just been, I'm always facilitating conversations. I'm always right in the center of it. I wanted to step back and listen, and the listening was exquisite. The level of sharing and the kinds of experiences that have been shared have been really exceptional.
Thank you,
That's
Stevie.
all I wanted to say right now, because again, it's been a privilege to be able to step back and listen. And that's what I think most of us really need to do, a lot. And a lot of the different experiences that have been communicated, I heard it in them in all different ways, and they need to be amplified, and we need to have a lot more opportunity like you just provided, Birgit, so that we can share and go deeper and deeper.
Thank you. Thank you, Stevie. Thanks for that. I mean, it's always good, to just, just when you think that, you have nothing more to give or to share, in actuality, you do, because whether you're on, one end of that line or the other, what we need is to engage each other, that we can start to build on those things that tear down those barriers and bring our ideologies together, or at least to help us to understand why we're on opposite ends of that line, if not physically, but emotionally or maybe intellectually, so that we can stop looking at the differences we see and start seeing the commonalities that we are.
Right.
So I appreciate you all being here and listening, sharing.
So
And-
I think I see Regina's hand.
Regina?
yeah, okay.
Well, I had to leave for a moment, but this has been one of the very best. I would agree with Stevie in the level and the depth of sharing. I feel so, as an all-white person, I'm way on the other end, looks-wise, always have been, but I've been engaged in many situations with people of color that have been very positive. And I can't help being white. That's another way of this experience. And I've lived in India, I've been all over the world. And it's profoundly sad, the situation. I mean, I have to live with that sadness, deep sadness, profound sadness. And we have to live in that sadness and be a part of the clearing up. India did it. Thank goodness for Gandhi. We don't have a Gandhi, but we have us. And I think us is going to do it. It's not going to necessarily be a person. It's going to be all of us working together. And I think that's, if that's the hope of America, great, we can do it. And I think if we can do a transformation, that's the best power we can show to the world. We want to be a leader. This is a place to be the leader in being able to overcome this from the inside out. My sense is that there's a lot of deconstruction going on and a lot of construction around the race issue. And everything else seems to spin off of that. I mean, this is the flaw of America. If America's going to be saved, it has to correct this flaw, period. I mean, that's it, as I see it. Thank you.
Regina, you've been coming to many of our programs, and this, I believe, is the first time you ever spoke. So I'm really glad that we heard from you. It's been a great discussion, Birgit. I do hope that people think more about this conversation and what to say, maybe when you hear someone say to someone, you don't like this country, go back to your country. Do you just stand there and hear it, or do you speak up? Or when somebody, says, oh, America, love it or leave it, or, when you see the American flag being used as a weapon, as, being shown on trucks and just places where it's more of almost a terror tool than it is a flag. Thank you very much. Sarah, who is from our library, said she's always so impressed with my friend Birgit, so smart and insightful. These programs that allow for participants to share their stories and connect are really important. Thank you. Let's talk about race. And Birgit already responded. And I have to say, as I always plug in all of these programs, don't miss Miss Sierra's diversity program. It's held monthly on Saturdays. You can also see it recorded for young children. It is unbelievable. I mean, she really rocks. And if you do have young children, it is never too young to start talking about race. I also want everyone to know that our next program in May, which I believe is the 26th, we should have Claire Garland as our guest to talk about the Indigenous people in New Jersey, Monmouth County, and Lorraine Stone will be joining her for that program. Anybody else have anything to share?
I just want to say thank you all. Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating. And it's always been my pleasure to lend whatever I can to help us to understand each other better than we do.
Thank you so very much.
Birgit,
Birgit.
I consider it a privilege to know you, to be your friend. I hope I'm your friend.
Thank you.
I think of you as a local rock star.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Birgit. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
Birgit.
everyone for coming.
Kind words, very kind
Thanks so
words.
much.
Nice
We'll
to
see
see
you
you,
again
Chad.
next month. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yes,
now.
thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Be well.